All right, how's everybody doing today? And welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel. We focus on great theories of everything, ancient and modern. Help you with your paradigm shifting, your awakening to 5D consciousness, your formation of a holistic worldview, and your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. And we take a look at theories of everything and try to mash them up and dice them up and show you, what they're made of so that you can figure out the best ways to use them in your own life. We focus on the obscure, things you probably haven't heard about. And in this case, we are doing a book which is a history of these people who spent their whole life working on something and put it together, did a great job, but aren't really being recognized at this point. And in this case, we're talking about some great African-American musicians from the 20th century and how they took their kind of native jazz and reinserted a spiritual element into it. And the book is called It's After the End of the World. Don't you know that yet? This is episode 4, or day 4 of reading through this. So we are in chapter 1. We're about to start section 7 called Cosmic Myth. And this chapter is really about Sun Ra and the beginning to form his orchestra. So a lot of it is like background information from his early life. Okay, 7, Cosmic Myth. And we just got done where he had an alien encounter. And most historians, I guess, about Sun Ra place his alien encounter in the 1950s, when it was a kind of a thing. But it's possible to read the evidence as the encounter being in the 1930s, when Sun Ra was in his early 20s, because he was in Chicago at that time, and he did get a union card. He joined the Black Musicians Union, I believe, in 1934. So he had been to Chicago, and this encounter, which he calls, the beings were abducted him, took him to a planet that he thought was Jupiter through a process of transmolecularization. And he was told to quit school, quit his band, and stop tying up the music with money, politics, and show business, and to study it as a science for its own sake. And so this gave him a mission to go with his music. And he was already kind of like a savant type level musician. But he was also very disciplined. So, section 7, Cosmic Myth. It was perhaps a testament to his heightened sensitivity that Sun Ra had an alien encounter almost 2 decades before such encounters flooded the popular consciousness. Because he was one of the first, the date of Sun Ra's abduction experience is therefore one of historiographical importance. Many claim it was not until the 1950s, but Schwed asserts that Sun Ra had his abduction experience when he was living in Huntsville, Alabama in 1936, although Schwed admits that it could have been much later. In accounts that were very consistent from one interview to the next, Sonny explained that the abductors, quote, didn't force me to go, in a sense, and the way they did, they shined something on me like a giant spotlight. Then, all at once, I call it transmolecularization. I could see through myself, like everything. And then I went up and I found myself on another planet, and then I was up there by myself. I realized I was by myself and I was in a huge stadium, maybe about 5 blocks square, and I was in the last seat way up in the dark. I said, well, I'm up here by myself. I'm going to hide back here where they can't see me. I don't know why they brought me up here. And then it was they had antennas right here. He points at his face. Now, so I say, I'm not going down there. They look different from me. I don't know what they're going to do to me. And then they called my name. They teleported me to the stage. He cites in accounts of the experience that he was in college at the time, for his roommate read his diary of the experience and shared it with others in the residence hall. The contradiction is that in some accounts of that dream, Sun Ra mentioned that he was living in Chicago at that time, and he didn't move there until 1946. Shwed ultimately rejects the Chicago reference, but does not point to the fact that Sun Ra lived at least briefly on tour in Chicago during late 1934 and maybe even 1932. Because of a month-long engagement, he joined the Colored Musicians Union Local 208 there on December 15th, 1934. An earlier encounter makes more sense because in the 1930s, Sonny was in the early days of his professional career, still unsure of his ability as a band leader to please white audiences. He indicates surprise over being accepted by whites in Chicago. Shwed and others agree, however, in their interpretation of the experience as a religious conversion, which sometimes assumed the form of an alien abduction, especially as blacks moved to the cities and with the concomitant rise of the Nation of Islam. Within the city, outer space might appear to be the most direct path to nature. Shwed, moreover, interprets Ra's conversion to be a dedication to full-time musicianship, dedicating or deciding to give up his teacher training courses at Alabama A&M, which he did in the mid-1930s. But Sun Ra's conversion was more encompassing. Not only did he give up the teaching, but he also conscientiously gave up being a swing band leader and all the arranging for show business that went with it. The nationwide market for swing opened thousands of new jobs for jazz musicians, white and black, as long as the musicians were willing to travel continuously, play the arrangements, act professional, and work cheap. This development played into the hands of the institutional powers for the use of musicians as endorsers to increase consumption. Touring swing musicians were idolized by young boys throughout the country, and they served to lock a large segment of America into a consumer's mindset and into harmful addictions. Benny Goodman, for example, would endorse not only cigarettes, but also sweets, beer, Coca-Cola, and cars to nationwide audiences between and even during songs. As radio integrated, black band leaders began to endorse too. Sun Ra started to feel that he was leading young people astray with orchestral swing. He said that the space beings admonished him that, quote, the teenagers in America down here, they're going to get all out of order. They're going to be a big generation gap, and it wasn't going to be where they'd be able to control it. They told me everything that was going to happen. They wanted to teach me what to do when that happened. As a result of their warnings, his post-abduction preparation was at first to play for no one but the Creator. In addition to conscientious objection to institutional arrangement, Sun Ra also sought an alternate mythology. His account of the abduction relates that the aliens also told him that the Creator wanted him to do something truly creative, something that hadn't been done before, the most difficult problem on the planet. Along with music, he eventually decided that his monumental task would be to find the true meaning of the Bible. the book that has, quote, confounded all wise men throughout the world, throughout history. From the time of his abduction until at least 1971, Sun Ra put tireless energy into unraveling this mystery. No doubt, Sun Ra made significant findings, for by the 1950s he had become an active participant in the underground Afrocentric movement centered around Washington Park on Chicago's South Side, Bronzeville neighborhood. The park was at the margins of respectable black life, and it was the scene of many untold moments in Bronzeville history. The Rosicrucians, for example, were one of many black cabals who operated in the underground of black society with their epicenter in Washington Park. Groups from the Rosicrucians to Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, to Noble Drew Ali's Circle 7 Temple, Daddy Grace's House of Prayer, Father Divine's Peace Mission, the Nation of Islam, the Black Jews, and dozens of others made the Kabbalistic scene in Bronzeville extensive enough so that anyone who was interested in it could find an outlet there. Sonny belonged to no cabal, or rather he started his own. He was a frequent speaker in this Southside Forum who offered to answer all questions about the Bible. Moreover, that's a quote, answer all questions about the Bible. Moreover, his involvement in the 1950s points toward the earlier dates for the abduction because he would have had more time to master the intricacies of the biblical scriptures, even though he claimed much earlier in his life that he had already learned all the lessons of the Bible when he was not even a teenager. From the point of his conversion and in the mid-1930s, Sonny gradually, ambivalently began to construct his conscientious objection and inverted alternative to American society's institutional show business. Okay, that's the end of that section. This section starts, it's called The Creator. After his abduction, Sonny began to believe more fervently in the Creator. Letting go of his old ways was not all fun, however. Instead, Sun Ra had described how the Creator's process of revealing the true meaning of the Bible was, quote, very terrible for me. The Creator revealed to him how to read the relevant ancient languages and showed him the profound flaws in his original interpretation of the Bible. The abduction experience and the subsequent religious conversion caused Sonny to begin to move away from both teaching and touring. For example, unlike popular swing musicians of the day, whose focus was on the happy side of mundane life, two of Sonny's early compositions from that period were entitled Thermodynamics and Fission. The music of the spheres and his research on the Bible now took top priority. Similarly, he continued to teach, but now he chose the subject matter. Sermons on ancient history, religion, mythology, music, outer space, and metaphysics. Not only his own band, but also many out-of-town musicians would make it to the first floor of his aunt's house for what were sometimes all-night sessions to learn about the Creator's music. As his research deepened, it became clear to him that the Creator was different from God. The Creator was God for, quote, dark people, he would say, those oppressed by a violent society. The Creator was for those who believe that if Americans can be godly and still be this way, then their God must not be too good. You have to judge, quote, you have to judge the tree by the fruit, he would say in this context. For Sun Ra, God was now the name of a failed intergalactic government who took over planet Earth sometime after the real God abdicated control to his ally and friend Satan. God, Satan, and the new governmental God, called No God, said Sun Ra have done an inadequate job. It was up to humans to appeal to a higher source, the Creator, by declaring that, quote, this is not a good creation. The creator told Sonny not to participate in the school and its fundraising, and from that belief he came to understand conscientious objection. Instead of being a school band leader, he chose to spend his 20s studying, learning, and exploring music, the Bible, and space, to build an alternative vision which would account for all his experiences. With the abduction, Sonny's world was turned upside down. But in the relatively secure environs of his aunt's house in Black Birmingham, Sonny sustained his new worldview and developed a creative system inverting the institutional worldview. The inversion not only set his world aright, but also became a platform for recruiting others. This section is called The Practice of Conscientious Objection. During this lengthy period of objection, when Sonny felt that his peers were being led astray by religion and show business, he began to establish a lifestyle that was more in keeping with his new mission. In Schwed's account, Sonny's daily regimen during this decade included transcribing records in the morning, walking downtown to the library and the music store, and conducting rehearsals at his home at night. Each of these aspects was important to the development of his alternative myth. First, Sonny listened to and transcribed records by the great black band leaders from the 20s and 30s, Fletcher Henderson, Duke Ellington, King Oliver, Count Basie, Jimmy Lunsford, and Earl Hines, and solo pianists such as Fats Waller. He also cited other early bands now mostly lost to history, the Sunset Royals, the Carolina Cotton Pickers, Felton's Florida Stompers, and Zakk Whyte. For Sonny, transcribing was an early antidote to media recording. While most consumers use records for their physical, sensual value, Ra used them for research, translating favorite pieces of music into a form he could share with his band for purposes of his own self-arrangement, teaching, research, and experimentation. Sonny was a pioneer in transcribing. He was using recording technology creatively rather than using it for spectatorship and consumption as prescribed. He used records in a disciplined manner to extend the music through careful research, to use for his own creativity, to extend the recorded product rather than to exhaust it through consumption. One of the most friendly white men in Birmingham was Mr. Forbes, the owner of the local music store, who gained the admiration of many a black musician by allowing them to walk in through the front door. Inside, Sonny would often give musical demonstrations of instruments, but he also was given time to transcribe many new musical pieces. He was able to borrow expensive instruments and to experiment with the new electronic instruments, including the Celeste and the Solovox. Sonny was not allowed inside the White Library, but could occasionally get someone who worked there to get the books out that he needed for his quest. His interests naturally broadened to encompass a wide range of topics in addition to books directly related to the Bible. Books about science beckoned him to answer questions about transmolecularization. He could also find new science fiction books at the Masonic Library. This library no doubt held numerous books about the occult. At that time, many were still categorized as science. Even before his abduction, Sonny had been impressed with the metaphysical teachings that described the power of the mind to work over matter. After the abduction, Sonny became thoroughly involved in a daily paper chase to connect ancient history, biblical religion, the music of the spheres, the problems of the culture of institutional show business, and outer space. At night, local and out-of-town musicians would visit Sonny's house to play music and attend Sonny's lectures. His bands would sometimes play in public, generally in front of black audiences, but in his home, the focus was mainly on experimentation. In particular, they practiced polyrhythms, a traditional African African practice. Quote, Sonny got rhythms going where you couldn't tell where the beat was, according to one band member from that period. They also dealt with his harmonic inversions. In addition to standard inverted chords, he began to utilize the unconventional harmonies of experimental musical instruments. There are no known recordings of this band, though some could turn up because Sonny had also begun to involve himself in tape recording as soon as the technology became available. When others were using tape recording as an amusement, he was already using it pragmatically. Sonny's alternate mythology also crossed over into everyday secular life. For example, he apparently used to visit the Modern Bookshop, a store run by Birmingham's Communist Party leader Jane Speed from 1937 to 40. As he learned more about contemporary political issues, he struggled to understand suffering. His answer was similar to other nonviolent advocates and religious practitioners before him. Be creative, embrace suffering, and transform it by using suffering to provide for the potential enlightenment of others. By embracing suffering, Sonny showed that a person had the freedom to reject his emotional attachments for the sake of a higher ideal. His actions and experiences created the basis for a conscientious objection to the institution's mediated worldview and its link to the emotions and desires of Earth people. In this way, he learned to transcend other people's suffering through his own. Sonny demonstrated a more concrete commitment to his beliefs after the war started and he was inducted. At about age 27, Sonny Blunt declared himself a conscientious objector to World War II, claiming that he, quote, did not have the right to fight. He was one of only 43,000 Americans and just a few hundred African Americans to object to this popular war against Hitler and Pearl Harbor. Perhaps Sonny's most fundamental objection was to death itself. He could not understand why, quote, if there was a God, people had to die. His experiences as a conscientious objector gave him a perspective on being physically as well as mentally at the very margins of American society. It also shows how he was already confident with his knowledge of the Bible. In his draft board trial, he defended himself, quote, citing chapter and verse impressively enough to make the judge say, "I never seen a nigger like you before." The war experience exposed Sonny to orthodox Gandhianism, a karmic understanding of violence, using self-sacrifice in order to expose and demonstrate the truth about a situation for the benefit of others. In Birmingham, Louis Burnham and other blacks tried to redirect black patriotism towards civil rights with his credo, quote, nonviolence and non-cooperation, which inspired Martin Luther King to such measures in Birmingham 13 years later. Burnham made reference to Gandhi, but Sonny was referenced more strongly by the White Fellowship of Reconciliation group that he encountered at the Pennsylvania work camp. The FOR included numerous Gandhian disciples, including Richard Gregg, who had gone to India to study at Gandhi's ashram and had written The Power of Nonviolence in 1934. We are not certain of their interactions at the civilian work camp to which Sonny was briefly assigned after a short jail stay for refusing to report, before he was released for health reasons. But Sonny was extremely favorable in his later reflections about the FOR. Gandhi's example, combined with his musical experiences, may have helped him see the strategic connections between social change and the creative musical inversion which he would achieve with an orchestra. Okay, this section is called Bronzeville, Chicago. When he returned to Birmingham after his release, things mostly returned to normal, but to some extent the war jeopardized his band. Some older established black musicians who saw a duty in serving the country to prove themselves to whites put him on their blacklists, so to speak. Still, not many musicians had heard of his ordeal. Some just assumed by default that he had been inducted and served. Nonetheless, a few years later, after his great aunt died, Sonny saw no reason to remain in the South, and just like thousands of other Birminghamians that decade, he decided to move to Chicago. After several years of acclimating himself to his new worldview, he came to Chicago with a plan, not just to object to the mediated worldview, but actually to propose and enact an alternate worldview for the one he found so lacking. Blacks, especially after World War I, added a large group to the northern urban migration. Black musicians, for example, responded quickly to the new frontiers that resulted from the popularity of jazz. They came to the city pursuing dreams, and they were to find out that the American dream consensus circulating in Bronzeville was real for a while, but ultimately delusional. Outspoken black leaders, however, were among the last to realize this. Like Booker T. Washington, these leaders believed in a chimerical consensus and they instilled it into the people without knowing these leaders believed in a chimerical consensus, and they instilled it into the people without knowing that the dream would be obsolete even before it could be realized. This Bronzeville dream might be best summarized as the race myth. Race may have been coined by, and it was most strongly exhorted by, Robert Abbott, editor of the Chicago Daily Defender, black newspaper from its founding in 1905 until his death in 1940. Abbott's newspaper was disseminated widely in Chicago and throughout the South. As a Chicago entrepreneur, he ruthlessly advertised for the city of Chicago, especially in a campaign from 1915 to 1919 that encouraged blacks to get out of the racist South. His success was enabled because he, quote, dared to articulate in print what Southern blacks were afraid to whisper. He used biblical terms like the Promised Land to describe Chicago, and many Southern black sharecroppers responded. John Michael Spencer calls Abbott Moses, inaugurating a black exodus. The official campaign ended when the 1919 Chicago race riot debunked the notion of Chicago as a promised land. But even after the campaign, Abbott continued to be a staunch defender of the race. Abbott's general belief was that whites were the winners, but if blacks master white systems, if blacks stand up for themselves, if blacks assert their rights, blacks will reap from the system the same benefits as whites. Abbott believed that the South was racist, but in the North, blacks had an equal chance to get ahead if they were organized. As Drake and Caton argued, race required strong institutions to imitate those of whites. The Defender also imitated the institutional representational worldview of whites, the belief in a harmonious state of affairs and in commercial power. Orchestra leader Dave Payton, for example, wrote a column for the Defender from 1924 to 29, which explained how the race should be represented. Payton did not speak for all musicians, but they paid attention to his column, for he articulated the path of least resistance for getting ahead. Payton, like American advertisers of the same period, was trying to turn his line of work into a profession. As a result, he never tired of enumerating bad habits which musicians ought to avoid: arriving late, entering in a club in a loud, indiscreet manner, smoking and drinking on the bandstand, criticizing the band leader, taking unnecessarily and frivolously to one another and to patrons. Talking unnecessarily and frivolously to one another and to patrons, flirting with customers, playing in a slouched position with legs crossed, and beating time with feet. Peyton firmly believed classical music to be superior to jazz and sought to imitate white orchestras. He advised black musicians to put in 2 or 3 hours a day on your scale work and stay away from jazz music. The defender's ethic can be described as an imitation of white institutions concealed as an outright opposition to white society. Abbott and other black leaders used the same beliefs and same morals as whites. It was only a different race that was the target of their boosterism. Abbott would cry racism when the white elites profited from destructive business practices, but he would cry race when it was one of his own. Many neighborhood heroes were created by the black race ethic. Black media interests, especially the Defender, had a long history of congratulating black entrepreneurs regardless of the ethics of their enterprises. In fact, the new leadership class in Black Chicago after the turn of the century was often openly associated with the, quote, shady interests of hustlers and pimps like Robert Motts and Teenan Jones. The black media would use the incantation of race to bias their readers and to disguise their imitations of white institutions. To a large segment of the public, the particular kind of business these black leaders were doing became irrelevant. If it was providing goods, services, and fame that benefited the race, then it was above scrutiny. The ethic of race was taken into the mainstream as more legitimate business ventures were formed on the South Side. Okay, I think we're going to stop there, and we'll finish this section and probably get close to finishing the chapter then tomorrow. So, thanks for tuning in today. Please come back tomorrow.